Greetings to everyone listening now. The passage set for us today is Deuteronomy chapter 1 verses 9 to 18. But I feel that the Lord has prompted me to begin at a different starting point, not with Moses, who is speaking in Deuteronomy 1:9, but with promises that God gave to Abram in Genesis. At first sight, Abram appears to have nothing to do with the passage set for today. So I need to ask you to bear with me until it becomes clear how Abram is linked to Moses in our passage. We begin in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 27. You will see there that Terah was the father of Abram, and it was Terah who made the decision to leave the city of Ur in the south of modern-day Iraq with all his household and travel to Canaan, or Israel as we know it. However, Terah never got to Canaan, the land of promise, because he settled himself in Haran, about 700 miles north of Ur. But Abram, Terah's son, now aged 75 years and following the death of his father, clearly heard the call of God to move his life on to reach God's goal for him. Genesis 12:1 says, "The Lord said to Abram, go from your country," meaning Haran, "and all your father's household to the land I will show you." Abram obeyed God's call. He set out from Haran with his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and their combined households, leaving behind everything that remained of his father's wealth and estate. Whilst he had been residing in Haran, Abram had increased greatly in wealth and in the number of people and their families who helped him make his estate profitable. But he and his wife remained childless. Even so, it was a sizable company that Abram led southwards for another 600 miles until he set foot in the land of the Canaanites, who were grandsons of Noah, and a pretty rough lot they turned out to be. Genesis 12:7, the Lord appeared to Abram as he was walking, and as they entered Canaan, he expands his first promise, saying, "To your offspring I will give this land." Now, that is a jaw-dropping promise to a nearly 80-year-old man who is both landless, childless, and considering possessing territory occupied by the dreaded Canaanites. But will this deter God from his plan for Abram? Not in the least. God will not change his plan for you or me or Abram, just because of our adverse or competing earthly circumstances. But he will change both Abram and us to fulfill his plan. Chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. They've walked another 100 miles, and God speaks again as they draw close to the southern border of Canaan. "All the land that you are seeing now," God says, "I will give to you and your offspring forever." Verse 16 speaks of a great increase in the number of offspring, and in verse 17 God gives Abram a second command, saying, "Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, look at it all, because I'm giving it to you." And the implication here is that God has already begun the act of giving the land to Abram. At that moment, Abram began to believe that the land was his, and the realization catapulted him into action. Chapter 13 and verse 18. He took God at his word and moved with every person and everything he possessed, and pitched his tents at Hebron. And then he built an altar to the Lord. Now this altar The altar of sacrifice signified the total surrender of Abram's life and all that he had to the God who speaks to him, the God who hears him, the God who sees him and answers his prayers and fulfills all the desires of his heart. So here was Abram, alive and living in the very land that God had promised he would possess. But still Abram doubted when he thought of moving northwards into the great armies of Canaanites, who would be more than keen to prevent his progress. He really needed assurance from God that God would act for him if and when war was declared. Well, God assured Abram in a most amazing way. An army came from the Far East to re-establish Babylonian rule over Canaanite rebels living around the Dead Sea. The Canaanites were defeated whilst Abram stood by and watched. Many Canaanite soldiers were killed, scores fled to the hills or fell into the numerous tar pits which littered the land, and some were taken off into captivity, including Abram's nephew Lot and all his possessions. Now Abram involved himself in the fight. Now, at this moment. Why? Because his own nephew Lot was in the hands of the invaders. So with 318 men from his own household, Abram chased the eastern king who had captured Lot, defeated his army and took back everything and every person belonging to Abram that had been captured. Returning home to Hebron, Abram is met by the king and priest Melchizedek from Jerusalem, who uttered this blessing. Chapter 14 and verse 20. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, Creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. With his eastern enemies routed and the Canaanite army weakened, Abram's faith was stirred, and the Lord came again to Abram in 15:4 and promised him that there would be no heir from outside the family to inherit Abram's estate, but a son of Abram's own flesh and blood, and the total number of his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And then, on the strength of God's aid in the battle, Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited that belief to Abram as righteousness. I say that again, the Lord credited that belief to Abram as righteousness, which just goes to prove what we believe in, which says that belief or faith comes before our righteous works. Yet Abraham still wasn't entirely happy. Chapter 15 and verse 6, because he asked, how can I know that I will gain possession of the land? Abram realized that living in the land as he was doing was not the same by any means as possessing the land, for possession of the land meant rulership of all the people living there. The time had come for God to reveal his hand and play his ace. And this is the final and only thing that God can do for Abram without destroying Abram's God-given free will. You see, God could force Abram to follow his plan. He could force him, bend his will to believe. But he would never ever do that. For God does not want us as his puppets, but as his partners. So he makes an everlasting covenant, an unbreakable promise with Abram and the nation of people who will descend from him. This covenant is a solemn oath, made by God alone upon the precious lifeblood of slaughtered animals. And in order to ratify the covenant or make it officially valid, God then appears to Abram in the form of a stone firebox full of hot coals, with smoke billowing into the night air and a blazing torch. So we have fire, we have smoke, we have blazing light, and all three of those are symbols of God's holy presence passing through the pieces of the slaughtered animals and assuring Abram that God would keep his oath on the life and the death of those animals. Chapter 15 and 18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi or river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates." And that brings the land under the covenant. And chapter 17 and verse 4 says, "You will be the father of many nations," thus bringing Abram's offspring and following descendants under the covenant. Abram's part in the covenant is to continue to walk faithfully and blamelessly before the Lord, 17 and 1. And the same chapter, verse 10, to maintain the sign of the covenant by circumcising every male in the household and every baby boy subsequently born. And because of the blessing of this covenant that God had so graciously made, Abram worshipped him. But God hadn't yet finished pouring his grace into Abram's life. He put a ha into Abram's name, verse 5. And I believe that the ha is God's breath, God's Spirit, breathing new life and power into this 99 years old man. Not only did he become the father of Isaac by Sarah in his 99th year, but after Sarah's death, he took Keturah as his wife and became the father of 6 more children and lived until he was 175 years old. Something must have happened. Something must be miraculous here. At this point, we are getting very close to our Deuteronomy passage. But before we leave Genesis for Deuteronomy, let's just turn back to chapter 15 and verse 12. I've been saving this till last because it is a most remarkable prophecy that God gives to Abram, indelibly marking the link between him and Moses. God tells him 4 things about the future, and they're all things that we know came true. He tells him about the 400 years of enslavement and ill treatment of Abram's descendants. He tells him about the rescue of his descendants and the wealth they were given and the punishment meted out to them by their captors. And then God assures Abram of his own long life and peaceful departure. And in verse 16 the prophecy says, "In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, i.e., to Israel. Now I wonder who in particular was born out of the 4th generation from Abraham. Now let's count them back. Isaac was Abram's first and only child at that time. First child. And Isaac was the first of the generations. Jacob was born to Isaac and was the second of the generations. Levi was born of Jacob, and Levi was the 3rd generation. And then in the 4th generation, Amram was born. And who was Amram's child by Jochebed? Jochebed. Yes, I don't know whether you guessed that or you knew it, but yes, it was Moses. Moses was the 3 times great grandson of Abraham. And now we are in Deuteronomy. It was a long trek to get there, but it was a long trek for us to get there. But here we are. And when I got to this point in my preparation, I previously hadn't understood why God had led me to Genesis and Abraham. But at this point I began to understand. Moses is almost a carbon copy of his ancestor Abraham. Listen to this. They were both exemplary leaders. They both encouraged the people to worship at Mount Horeb. They both made epic journeys. They both had the same call from God to take the land of Canaan as their possession. And they both led a huge number of people of all ages and differing needs, who all looked to their leader to find water and suitable places to camp, or to settle disputes and keep the peace. In Deuteronomy 13:18, Moses realizes, this is our passage for today, Moses realizes that he must delegate some of his responsibilities and lists some of the qualifications for being a leader. A leader must be wise, he said, understanding, respected by the community, a judge who would hear and judge fairly and impartially cases brought by their own people or foreigners residing with them, and make no racial distinctions, nor differentiate between rich and poor. A leader must be courageous and wouldn't be afraid to pass judgment on anyone. And the end of verse 17 is the mark of an experienced leader, like Moses himself, one who would willingly take responsibility for the very hard cases. Now I think you will all agree with me when I say this, that this list of qualities adds up to sound, practical advice, especially when we as a congregation are being asked now to choose leaders, as we were only last year. I think it was last year. But I just couldn't understand why God had led me all the way through Abraham's journey and linked it beautifully to the birth of Moses, just to give me a list of common sense, practical instructions. There must be more to it than that. And my time for preparation was becoming perilously short. What on earth could I do with the time I had left? And then I remembered that our speaker on our first week had mentioned 4 things that the writer of Deuteronomy was trying to teach us. And the third thing was spiritual maturity. Suddenly, like a thunderclap, it hit me. Everything fell into place for me. If we are going to grow good leaders, then we must look more deeply than this practical list in Deuteronomy. Okay, it'll do for a start, but there's something deeper which not only applies to our leaders but applies to everybody in the church. You see, those epic journeys of both Abraham and Moses were not simply mundane treks from one waterhole to the next, striving against the odds for survival. No, they were inward, spiritual journeys towards spiritual maturity for Moses, for Abraham, and for everyone else, including us, if we will follow their example. For instance, we remember when Terah led his household to go to Haran. Terah decided that he wanted to settle there. So instead of pressing on to Canaan, the land of promise and God's goal for Terah, he settled in Haran, the land of ease and comfort, Terah's goal for himself. And that is where he died, just a few years later. What a lesson in spiritual maturity that is for us. You see, our Christian lives will never mature and never bear fruit if we fall at the first hurdle. If we fail to answer yes to God's call to press on towards his goal for us, instead of pressing on to our goal for us, being concerned for our own ease and comfort, and settling for the easiest and most agreeable path. If we choose our own comfort at the expense of obedience to God's call, the spirit within us will stagnate, it will stop growing, and eventually it will die, because God's life and God's purpose for us will depart from us, because he finds no genuine will or desire in us to follow him and do what he desires us to do. Answering and obeying God's call is the first step to spiritual maturity. But if you don't take this step, how can you travel any further? Moses nearly didn't travel at all. He was called, Exodus chapter 4, to speak to the elders of Israel, and the excuses that he made to God were unbelievable. I am not eloquent, he said. I am slow of speech and tongue. I really cannot do that. Please send somebody else. Or as we might say, let somebody else do it. Were it not for the Lord's good grace, Moses would have failed at the first hurdle. But the Lord persevered with him until Moses did as he was bidden. Moses heard God's call, but he was beginning to wish that he hadn't, because he felt the task was too hard for him. People, I want to tell you today that the jobs that God calls us to do are always too hard for us. They have to be. Of what use would an 18-inch high hurdle be to a trainee hurdler? He could hop over it easily, but his physical development and stamina would have made no progress. And the spiritual hurdles that God sets up for us are designed to build a strong and enduring faith. And the Lord calls us to do impossible tasks because we have to learn that nothing is too hard for the Lord to do through us. We are his vehicle. We are his means of doing his jobs in this world. And in conclusion, the Lord has given me 3 words. I'll keep them as short as I can. 3 words for you to take away. And the first is listen. As you walk through your normal everyday life, develop an attitude of listening. Listening, not listening to music, not even worship music, but listening for God's call to take another step along your road towards spiritual maturity. And the second word is wait. In this age of instant coffee, delivery next day and meals in moments, we've almost forgotten the meaning of the word wait. When difficult circumstances arise in your life, pray first and then wait in prayerful trust that the Lord is on the case, doing his job in his time, and he will tell you clearly if he needs you to help him. There are too many people in our churches, like Sarah, trying to help God fulfill his plan. I want to tell you that God is quite capable of fulfilling his own plans. Only sometimes does he need our help, especially our voices. And Abraham looked as though he would never ever have a son, but was prepared to pray and wait. But Sarah interfered with the Lord's work and caused absolute havoc in the home. So listen for God's call. Wait for him to act for you. Wait for him to act for you. And lastly, remember the covenant he has made with each and all of us. And God's part in the covenant he's made to us is for him to be the one great lover of our soul. And our part is to do our utmost to be like him. First Epistle of John chapter 3 verses 2 and 3 tell us that. And let us imagine Jesus' slaughtered body lying there in place of the dead animals, the victim of the sacrifice willingly offered. And then imagine yourself passing through the body of the slaughtered Christ, and God coming along in the same pathway, to meet us. And when we meet at the centre, God gives us his life and we give him ours. We make that eternal transaction, and the covenant is eternally ratified. And the sign of our covenant is the bread and wine, which symbolize Christ's slaughtered flesh and spilt blood, reminding us that he is ours and we are his. We are within him and he is within us. And our greatest purpose in life is to walk with him and be like him. Old age is not a sign of maturity, and neither is youth a sign of immaturity. For God looks at our eternal soul to see how far we each have travelled on our spiritual journey. On our spiritual journey. And may our Lord bless each one of us as we seek to listen to his call. Listen for his call. Wait for him to speak and act. And remember his unbreakable covenant where we are within him and he within us. Amen.